800 miles from any runway, over dark open water at night, a pilot loses an engine with no place to land. Rescue support is limited. With no other choice, she makes a desperate radio call, and reaches the Marshal no one expected to answer. What happens next will surprise you. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Captain Eva Reyes checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes. It was 2:14 in the morning. The cargo plane, a twin-engine turboprop loaded with medical supplies, was flying over open ocean. Below her was nothing but black water. Above her was a thick layer of cloud that blocked out the stars. She had been flying this route for 6 years, carrying supplies between small island communities that had no other way to get help. Tonight the route felt longer than usual. Eva had grown up far from the ocean, in a small farming town where the sky was the only wide open space she had ever known as a child. She had wanted to fly since she was 8 years old, when her uncle took her to a small local airfield and let her sit in the cockpit of an old training plane. That single afternoon had changed the direction of her whole life. She studied hard, worked odd jobs to pay for flying lessons, and slowly built her career one small aircraft at a time, until she finally earned a place flying cargo routes across some of the most remote stretches of ocean in the world. She loved the job because it mattered. The islands she flew to depended on these deliveries for medicine, food, and basic supplies that could not arrive any other way. She took the responsibility seriously, more seriously than most people who did not fly this route could ever understand. Her co-pilot, a young man named Marcus Webb, sat beside her checking the fuel numbers. He had joined the company only 8 months ago. This was his first long overwater flight at night. His hands moved carefully over the controls, the way a person moves when they are still learning to trust their own judgment. "Fuel looks fine," Marcus said quietly. "We are on schedule, right on time." Eva nodded but did not relax. She had learned a long time ago that the ocean did not care about schedules. She had learned that a plane could feel perfectly fine one moment and be in serious trouble the next. She kept her eyes moving across the instrument panel, checking each number the way a careful driver checks mirrors on a long highway. The plane was flying at 22,000 feet. Below them was 800 miles of open water. There was no runway anywhere close. The nearest airport behind them was already too far to reach safely. The nearest airport ahead of them was still hours away. If anything went wrong right now, there would be no place to land. This thought had crossed Eva's mind many times over the years, but tonight it felt heavier than usual, almost like a warning. The plane hummed steadily through the darkness, the sound of both engines blending into a low, familiar drone that had become almost like background music to Eva after so many years of flying. Outside the window, there was nothing to see except the faint outline of clouds passing below, lit only by the weak glow of the plane's own navigation lights. Marcus glanced occasionally at his phone, which had no signal this far from land, before putting it away each time with a small, embarrassed smile. Eva understood the habit. Even experienced pilots sometimes reached for a connection to the world below, even when they knew it was useless out here. She thought about the supplies sitting in the cargo hold behind them, boxes of medicine bound for a small clinic that served 3 different island communities. She thought about the families waiting for those supplies, people she had never met but who depended on flights like this one every single month. It was this thought, more than anything else, that kept her focused during the quiet hours of a long overnight flight. The job was never just about flying a plane from one point to another. It was about the people on the other end of the journey. At 2:31 in the morning, the warning came. A soft beeping sound filled the cockpit. A yellow light appeared on the right side of the instrument panel. Marcus straightened in his seat. "Right engine oil pressure is dropping," he said, his voice tight. Eva looked at the gauge. The needle was falling steadily, not fast, but steady, like sand draining from an hourglass. She reached for the checklist without panic. In her years of flying, she had learned that panic never solved a problem. It only made a person slower and less able to think clearly. Reduce power on the right engine, she said calmly. Let's see if it stabilizes. Marcus followed her instructions. For a moment, the needle held steady. Then it continued to fall. It's not stopping, Marcus said. Ava felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice even. Shut it down before it seizes. We fly on one engine. Marcus shut down the right engine according to procedure. The plane shuddered slightly as the propeller stopped turning and the wind resistance changed. The remaining engine on the left side had to work harder now to keep them in the air. Ava adjusted the controls, correcting for the sudden pull to the right side. The plane steadied, but it was flying slower now, and using more fuel than planned. The cockpit felt smaller now, the silence from the dead engine somehow louder than the noise it used to make. Marcus's breathing had quickened, and Ava could see a thin line of sweat forming along his hairline despite the cool cabin air. She understood his fear. She had felt the same fear many years earlier, during her own first serious emergency as a young pilot. But she also knew that fear left unchecked could spread through a cockpit like smoke, filling every corner until there was no room left for clear thinking. She kept her own voice slow and even, not because she felt calm inside, but because she knew Marcus needed to hear calm in order to think clearly himself. We need to find somewhere to land, Marcus said. Ava was already thinking the same thing. She pulled up the navigation display and looked at their position. The screen showed a wide stretch of blue water with no land markers anywhere close. The nearest island with any kind of landing strip was over 800 miles away in either direction. Even flying on one engine at a reduced but steady speed, they did not have enough fuel to make it that far, especially since the single working engine was burning fuel faster than two engines normally would at cruise power. Call it in, Ava said. Let them know our situation. Marcus reached for the radio and made the call to the Regional Air Traffic Control Center. He explained their position, their altitude, and the engine failure. The reply came back quickly, but it was not the reply they wanted to hear. Copy your emergency, the controller said. Be advised, there is no runway within your current range. Nearest airfield is 790 miles east. Search and rescue coordination in your sector is currently limited due to a storm system affecting our main rescue base. Please stand by. Marcus looked at Ava. What does limited mean? Ava did not answer right away. She understood exactly what it meant. The storm system the controller mentioned had likely grounded the helicopters and ships that would normally respond to an emergency like this. It meant that even if they managed to survive an emergency landing on water, help might take a very long time to arrive, if it arrived at all. She thought quickly. There had to be another option. She began going through everything she knew about this stretch of ocean. She remembered something from years earlier, something most pilots on this route had forgotten about or never learned in the first place. 3 years earlier, during a layover caused by bad weather, Ava had spent an evening at a small dockside restaurant on a nearby island, talking with an old fisherman who had lived in the region his entire life. He told her stories about the smaller islands scattered across that part of the ocean, places too small to appear on most maps used by commercial pilots. He mentioned, almost as a passing detail, an old radio station that had once served as a weather post during a time when the region had far more air and sea traffic than it did now. He said the station had officially closed years earlier, but that the man who once ran it never truly left. Ava remembered laughing politely at the story that night, thinking it was simply local legend, the kind of tale told to pass the time during a long layover. She had not thought about it again until this very moment. There was an old radio station on a small atoll almost directly along their current path. It had been built decades earlier as a weather and communication outpost. Most pilots assumed it had been closed for years. But Ava had once met an old radio operator during a layover on a nearby island. He told her the station was still active, run by a retired Coast Guard officer who had chosen to stay behind after the official station closed. He monitored radio frequencies out of habit and out of a sense of duty that had never really left him. People in the area sometimes called him the Marshal, a nickname from his old days coordinating rescue operations. Nobody expected him to answer distress calls anymore. Nobody even remembered to try. Ava decided it was worth a try. There was nothing to lose. "Marcus, switch to emergency frequency 25 she said. "I want to try something." Marcus looked confused but did as she asked. Ava took the radio microphone in her hand. Any station, this is Cargo Flight 117, declaring an emergency. Single engine failure, 800 miles from nearest runway. If anyone is listening on this frequency, please respond." Static filled the cockpit for a long moment. Marcus shook his head slightly, as if to say it was a waste of time. Ava kept her hand steady on the microphone and waited. Then, faintly, a voice broke through the static. It was an older voice, calm and steady, the kind of voice that came from someone who had spent a lifetime speaking through storms and static. "Cargo 117, this is Atoll Radio. I read you. Go ahead with your situation." Ava felt a small wave of relief pass through her chest, though she did not let it show in her voice. "Atoll Radio, we have lost our right engine due to oil pressure failure. We are flying on a single engine, 800 miles from the nearest runway in either direction. Regional Control has informed us that search and rescue support is limited due to weather. We need guidance." There was a short pause before the voice returned. "Copy that, 117. My name is Daniel Okafor, former Coast Guard Rescue Coordinator. I have been monitoring this frequency for 11 years, mostly out of old habit. I am glad someone finally called." Daniel had spent 30 years of his life coordinating search and rescue missions across this same stretch of ocean, first as a young officer learning the job, and later as the senior coordinator responsible for training an entire generation of rescue teams. When the regional government decided to close the old station and move all official operations to a larger base further north, Daniel had been offered a comfortable retirement on the mainland. He chose instead to stay behind on the small atoll where he had spent most of his working life. He told himself at the time that it was simply because he liked the quiet island life, the fishing, the slow mornings without deadlines. But the truth, one he rarely admitted even to himself, was that he could not bring himself to fully let go of the responsibility he had carried for so long. Every night, out of habit more than duty, he switched on the old radio equipment and listened, even though almost nobody called anymore. Marcus looked at Ava, his eyes wide. "Is this real?" Ava nodded, focusing on the radio. "Mr. Okafor, we need a plan. We cannot make it to a runway. Our fuel will not last that long on a single engine." Daniel's voice came back steady and clear, the voice of a man who had handled emergencies like this many times before, even if it had been years since the last one. "Understood. Listen carefully. There is a lagoon 18 miles from my location. It is calm water, protected by a reef, unlike the open ocean around it. Local fishing boats use it as a safe harbor during storms. It will not be a runway, but a calm water landing there gives you a far better chance than an open ocean ditching. I can guide you toward it, and I can get people moving to help the moment you are down." Ava felt her mind clear as a plan finally began to form. How long until we would reach that lagoon? Daniel paused, likely doing quick math in his head. "At your reduced speed, I estimate 1 hour and 40 minutes. What is your fuel situation?" Marcus checked the gauges and read the numbers aloud to Ava, who repeated them into the radio. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That is close," he said honestly. "It will be tight, but if you maintain a steady altitude and do not fight the wind more than necessary, you should make it with a small margin. I want you to trust me on headings. I know these waters and these winds better than any chart you have on board." Ava looked at Marcus. His face was pale, but he gave a small nod. "Let's do it," he said. "Atoll Radio, we are ready to follow your guidance," Ava said into the microphone. For the next hour, Daniel Okafor guided them with calm, clear instructions. He gave them small heading corrections to avoid headwinds that would waste fuel. He told them about a shift in wind direction he expected near a certain point, based on years of watching weather patterns in that part of the ocean. He kept his voice steady the entire time, never once sounding unsure, even though Ava knew he was working with old equipment and no official backup. At one point during the flight, Marcus asked quietly through the intercom, away from the open radio channel, whether they could really trust directions from a stranger on an old frequency instead of waiting for regional control to arrange something official. Ava thought about the question carefully before answering. She reminded him that regional control had already told them help was limited, and that limited help, arriving too late, was no help at all. She told him that sometimes the right choice was not the official one, but the one that gave them the best real chance of surviving the night. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then nodded and returned his attention to the instruments without arguing further. Daniel continued speaking through the static, describing landmarks that would not appear on any standard aviation chart, things only someone who had lived on that ocean for decades would know. He mentioned a stretch of current close to a smaller island that could push a low-flying aircraft slightly off course if the pilot was not careful. He mentioned the exact shape of a cloud formation that, in his experience, usually meant a brief clearing in the weather was coming, which would help visibility during their final approach. Ava listened closely to every word, adjusting her flying based on details that no instrument panel could have given her. At one point, the single working engine sputtered slightly, and the plane dipped for a few seconds before Ava corrected it. Marcus gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles turning white. "Everything all right up there?" Daniel asked immediately, having heard the change in engine sound through the radio connection, or perhaps simply sensing it from experience. "We're okay," Ava said, though her hands were tight on the controls. "Engine is straining but holding." "You are almost to the point where you will start your descent," Daniel said. "When you are ready, I will talk you down toward the lagoon. It will be dark, but there are a few lights on the shoreline that fishermen use. Look for a cluster of small lights on your left side once you cross the outer reef line." Ava nodded to herself, even though Daniel could not see her. "Copy that." As the minutes passed, the fuel gauge dropped lower than Ava would have liked. She kept mental notes of their position, comparing it constantly with Daniel's directions. Marcus stayed quiet, focused entirely on monitoring the instruments, occasionally reading out numbers when Ava asked for them. Finally, Daniel's voice came through again. "You should be able to see the reef line now. Begin your descent, nice and steady. Aim for the widest section of calm water. I have already sent word to 2 fishing boats in the area. They are moving toward the lagoon now with lights and rescue equipment." Ava began the descent carefully, her hands steady despite the tightness she felt in her chest. She thought briefly about every emergency landing she had ever studied during her training years ago, every checklist she had memorized, every simulator session she had completed long before she ever imagined needing them over open ocean in the middle of the night. None of those lessons had prepared her for the strange mixture of fear and focus she felt now, but she trusted the years of practice sitting quietly behind her actions, guiding her hands even when her mind wanted to race. The plane dropped through the layer of thick cloud, and for a moment there was nothing but darkness outside the windows. Then, breaking through the bottom of the clouds, she saw it. A dark shape of land, and beyond it, a stretch of calm water reflecting a few scattered lights along the shore. "I see the lagoon," Ava said, her voice tight with cautious relief. "Good," Daniel replied. "Bring her down slow. Keep your nose level. The water there is calm, but it is still water, not concrete. Land as gently as you can." Marcus read out the altitude numbers as they dropped. 500 feet. 300 feet. 100 feet. The single engine strained against the descent, fighting to keep them stable. Ava focused completely on the controls, blocking out everything except the feel of the plane beneath her hands. 50 feet. The water below looked smooth in the moonlight breaking briefly through the clouds. Ava pulled back gently on the controls to slow their rate of descent as much as possible without stalling. 20 feet. 10 feet. The plane touched the water with a hard splash, sliding forward across the surface as spray flew up on both sides of the aircraft. Ava kept the controls steady, resisting the urge to fight the plane too much as it slowed. The aircraft skidded across the lagoon, water pounding against the underside of the fuselage, before finally coming to a stop, floating steadily on the calm surface. For a moment, neither Ava nor Marcus spoke. The cabin was filled with the sound of water lapping against the plane and their own heavy breathing. Ava looked down at her hands resting on the controls and noticed, almost distantly, that they were shaking now, though they had been perfectly steady only moments earlier during the actual landing. It was strange how the body seemed to wait until the danger had passed before finally showing any sign of fear. She took a slow breath, letting the cool night air drifting in through a small gap near the door calm her racing heart. Marcus let out a long breath beside her, running a hand through his damp hair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than usual, almost disbelieving. "We're down," Marcus said finally, his voice shaking slightly with relief. Ava reached for the radio microphone with a hand that was not quite steady. "Atoll radio, this is 117. We are down safely in the lagoon." Daniel's voice came back immediately, and for the first time, Ava heard real emotion in it. "Copy that, 117. Well done. The fishing boats should reach you within 15 minutes. Stay inside the aircraft until they arrive, keep your life vests on, and do not attempt to swim to shore. The current near the reef opening can be strong." They waited inside the floating aircraft, watching the small lights of two fishing boats slowly grow larger as they approached across the dark water. Within 20 minutes, the boats reached them. Local fishermen, alerted by Daniel's call, helped Ava and Marcus climb safely onto the boats before securing a line to the aircraft to keep it from drifting toward the reef. As the boat carried them toward the shore, Ava looked back at the plane floating quietly on the water behind them, its metal body catching small glints of moonlight. She thought about how close they had come to a very different outcome, and about the man on the radio who nobody expected to answer. The boat ride toward the island gave Ava a few quiet minutes to look around at the world she had almost never seen. The sky had cleared slightly, showing a scattering of stars above the dark water, and the air smelled of salt and diesel from the boat's small engine. The fishermen who had rescued them spoke little English, but their kindness needed no translation. One of them wrapped a dry blanket around Marcus's shoulders, while another offered Ava a cup of warm tea from a battered metal flask, without being asked. Ava accepted it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the warm cup, feeling the heat slowly return to her fingers after the cold night air in the open cockpit. As the small boat moved steadily across the calm lagoon toward the shore, Ava found herself thinking about how strange the whole night had been. Only a few hours earlier, she had been checking fuel numbers and watching clouds pass beneath a perfectly ordinary flight. Now she was sitting on a small fishing boat in the middle of the night, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, sipping tea handed to her by people who had risked their own safety to pull her and Marcus from the water without a second thought. She realized, not for the first time in her career, how much of survival depended not on machines or checklists alone, but on the quiet kindness of strangers willing to help when it mattered most. When they reached the small dock on the island, a figure was waiting for them. An older man, tall but slightly bent with age, wearing a worn jacket and holding a battered handheld radio. His eyes were sharp despite his years, and he watched their boat approach with quiet attention. "Mr. Okafor?" Ava asked as she stepped onto the dock. "Call me Daniel," he said, extending a steady hand to help her off the boat. "Glad you made it down safely, Captain." "You saved our lives tonight," Ava said. "Regional Control told us rescue support was limited. Nobody mentioned you." She studied his face for a moment, the deep lines around his eyes, the calm way he stood even now after guiding two strangers through a crisis in the middle of the night, and she felt a quiet gratitude that went far beyond simple politeness. It was the kind of gratitude that stays with a person for the rest of their life, resurfacing quietly every time they remember how close they came to a very different ending. Daniel gave a small, tired smile, the kind that carried both years of quiet loneliness and a deep sense of purpose all at once. Nobody remembers this old station anymore. Most days, nobody calls. I keep the radio running because old habits do not let go easily. Tonight, I am glad I never turned it off." He looked past her toward the dark water for a moment, as if remembering every other night he had sat alone by that same radio, waiting for a call that never came, before turning his attention back to the two exhausted travelers standing in front of him. Marcus, still shaken but steady on his feet, shook Daniel's hand firmly, holding on a moment longer than a normal handshake, as though the simple act of touching another person's hand helped confirm that they had truly survived. "Thank you. We would not have made it without your guidance," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. Daniel nodded simply, the kind of nod that came from a man who had spent his whole life doing his duty without expecting recognition. That is what the job is for, whether anyone remembers to call it in or not. The three of them walked together toward the small collection of buildings that made up the settlement, the sound of the ocean behind them, calm now, as if it had never posed any danger at all. Ava looked back one last time at the plane floating gently in the lagoon, and then forward at the quiet island ahead, grateful for a radio signal reaching an old station that almost nobody remembered, and for a Marshal that nobody expected would still be listening. In the days that followed, a proper recovery team arrived to secure the aircraft and arrange transport for Ava and Marcus back to the mainland. Word of the emergency landing spread quickly through the small aviation community that flew these remote island routes. Pilots who had flown this same stretch of ocean for years were surprised to learn that atoll radio was still active, and that the old station and its quiet operator had guided a crippled aircraft safely down when official channels could offer nothing more than a warning about limited support. Ava made sure to write a full report detailing exactly what had happened, including Daniel Okafor's role in the rescue. She wanted to make certain that his effort would not be forgotten again, the way the station itself had nearly been forgotten over the years. She requested that the Regional Aviation Authority formally recognize the station and provide it with updated equipment and proper support, so that the next flight that needed help would not have to depend on chance and an old memory of a layover conversation from years earlier. Marcus, for his part, found himself thinking differently about the ocean below every flight after that night. He had learned, in the most direct way possible, that an aircraft could fail even when everything seemed normal, and that survival sometimes depended not just on training and equipment, but on people who quietly kept doing their duty long after anyone expected them to. A few months later, Marcus applied for additional training in emergency procedures, wanting to be better prepared if he ever faced a night like that one again. He often told newer pilots at the company about the old radio operator who had saved their lives, making sure the story continued to travel through the small aviation community even as the years passed. The Regional Aviation Authority eventually responded to Ava's report. A small team was sent to the atoll to inspect the old station, and after some discussion, officials agreed to fund basic repairs and modern equipment for the outpost. Daniel was formally recognized for his years of unofficial service, though he accepted the recognition with the same quiet modesty he showed that night on the dock. He continued to run the station, now with better equipment and, for the first time in over a decade, an official listing on regional emergency frequency charts, so that any pilot flying that route in the future would know exactly who to call if trouble ever found them again. As for Ava, she continued flying the same route for years afterward, carrying supplies to the same small island communities. But now, every time she flew over that stretch of ocean, 800 miles from any runway, she remembered the calm, steady voice that had come through the static that night, guiding her down when there was nowhere else to turn. She never forgot the lesson that night had taught her, that sometimes the difference between disaster and survival is not a runway or a rescue helicopter, but simply someone, somewhere, who never stopped listening. Years later, when Ava had grown older and eventually stepped back from flying long overnight cargo routes, she still kept in touch with Daniel through occasional letters and radio calls, more out of friendship now than emergency. She often told the story of that night to younger pilots she trained, not as a tale of her own skill, but as a reminder that preparation and courage mattered most when paired with humility, and that sometimes the smallest, quietest efforts, kept alive by people nobody remembered to thank, were the very things standing between an ordinary flight and a tragedy. She made sure that every pilot she trained knew about atoll radio, not as a piece of history, but but as proof that somewhere out over that same wide, dark stretch of ocean, someone was still listening, ready to answer if they ever needed to make the same call she once made, 800 miles from any runway.